We are really honored to be joined this afternoon for our evening keynote by Dr. Stephen Hutchinson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Hutchinson received his degrees in comparative literature at the University of Chicago and is a specialist in early modern Spanish literature. His first book, Cervantine Journeys, investigates the relations between writing and travel, while his second book, Economia Ética en Cervantes, proposes a rethinking of ethics and literary studies. Professor Hutchinson edited the first monographic volume of the journal Y Humanista Cervantes under the rubric of Cervantes and the Mediterranean. I believe you have a project, an ongoing project on that topic. He's an author of dozens of articles. He's currently concluding a book project on writing the early modern Mediterranean. He is also vice president of the Cervantes Society of America and teaches and does research at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which I just want to note is the other UW, of course. We are the real UW.
I was going to say that.
But the real UW welcomes the other UW. We'll forget about the third UW. And we'll just say that we are so looking forward to your presentation on narrating the return journey. Dr. Stephen.
Thank you so much for this warm welcome.
Speak up a little bit.
Yes? Okay. And many, many thanks to Conchita, who's just come in, and Andres, and to both universities and to all of the organizations that have made this wonderful conference possible. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, to be with friends, and also to meet new friends, and have the panels have been extraordinary that I've attended. So absolutely delighted in every sense. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. Yes, I graduated from the U of C and now I teach at the UW. So that's I have to explain that in the last year I've had operations in my left eye, so I have to wear this. It's not Corsair disguise. So otherwise it would be so confusing because I have distortion in that eye. So I'll be reading about a perspectivist text with one eye. So. The final stretch of Don Quixote could be seen to start when the protagonists leave the ducal palace in chapter 58 of part 2, or in the next chapter when Don Quixote finds out about Avellaneda's false sequel to his own story, or when they encounter Roque Guinart, or arrive in Barcelona in the next chapter after that. Don Quixote's defeat on the shores of Barcelona in chapter 64 could also mark the turn towards closure, as could the return journey as of chapter 66. A case could even be made for the end of Sancho's Insula, or the encounter with Ricote back in chapters 53 and 54, as moments marking a definitive before and after, preventing the narrative from going back to the way things were before, and thus impelling the chronicle and novel towards some distant ending. Every one of these events denotes a change in perspective, a shift in the outlook and roles of either or both of the protagonists, accompanied by important changes of mood, no matter where exactly one locates the beginning of the end. The novel outlines significant transformations in both protagonists throughout this sequence. The intrusion of history into fiction, with the expulsion of the Moriscos, as well as the figure of Roque Guinart. The confrontation of Avellaneda's less authentic fiction within Cervantes' fictional text. The only urban and maritime experiences of the protagonists. The diminishing of Don Quixote's protagonism and the intensification of Sancho's. A stampede of bulls followed in the return by a stampede of swine in about the same place. The famed Arcadia, echoed in the return by Don Quixote's inspiration to adopt the pastoral life. The overlaying of martyrdom on penitence as Sancho needs to resuscitate Altisidora as well as disenchant Dulcinea by suffering pain. The journey, after leaving the ducal palace the first time, is rather different from what it was before. The pace and rhythm are different, as Don Quixote and Sancho can travel 5 or even 6 days without anything happening that would impede their movements or be worthy of telling. This would have been unthinkable in part 1 of the novel, and perhaps even the first half of part 2. But here Cervantes apparently wants to move his pieces quickly across the Aragonese landscape. There is a sense not of errancy, guided by the whims of Rocinante or Don Quixote, but of directionality toward clear destinations as the protagonists avoid Zaragoza and head to Barcelona and then homewards. Their journey is made up less of events and encounters than of dialogue, often with little intervention on the part of the narrator, except to tell us what gives rise to these conversations or interrupts them. As is the case in the entire second part of Don Quixote, these conversations are less focused on the world of the books of chivalry than they are on the character's experience and a full gamut of topics that life offers. Moreover, as we're all aware, the continual references to Cide Benengeli bolster the metafiction by providing us with a fictional account of the making of the fiction and by having the fictional chronicler inhabit the same space and time as the characters. Cide, for example, can take advantage of his characters being asleep to write and explain how the Duke and Duchess orchestrated the last major hoax. Durmiéronse los dos, y en este tiempo quiso escribir y dar cuenta Cide Hamete, autor de esta grande historia, que les movió a los duques a levantar el edificio de la máquina referida. This reminds me also of Tristram Shandy, when our fictional author has all of his characters occupied in one way or another on traveling or sleeping, and so he can finally, in page 300 or so, write his prologue. Symbiosis between the Muslim chronicler and the Christian knight-errant becomes so exclusively reciprocal that Cide Hamete metonymically tells his pen it will be able to say, "Para mí sola nació Don Quijote y yo para él. Él supo orar y yo escribir. Solos los dos somos para en uno." This is an ontological claim. They owe their being to each other, and they complement each other as a perfect unity. Cide Hamete thus becomes the first one to enjoy the fruits of these writings of his pen, and Avellaneda, with his rough ostrich feather, is the first one to be excluded. Before delving further into the idiosyncrasies of the return journey, I'd like to briefly bring into consideration a number of what I see as prevalent or conventional views regarding this final sequence of the novel. Let's say from chapter 59 on. 59 is when they discover that there's another second part, or there is a second part, rather, of Don Quixote. Regardless of whether Cervantes had already written previous episodes in response to Avellaneda's text, and there's some debate about that, it is, of course, as of this point, including the prologue, that the so-called false Quixote appears in so many guises. Although Avellaneda makes some offensive remarks in his prologue, in effect echoing what Cervantes says about himself in the prologue to the Novelas Ejemplares. I personally don't see Cervantes as obsessed with overcoming a supposed rival and finally triumphing over him. My own take is that the appearance of this other Quixote was an enormous stroke of luck that played into Cervantes' hands better than anything he could have invented, and that Cervantes makes the most of it to further develop the profoundly metafictional character of his own second part. This brings us to the widespread view that the last stretch of the novel is tinged with melancholy, a contagious sadness that affects readers who see how Don Quixote is mostly reduced to a spectator and figure of ridicule who, as of his defeat, is unable to intervene as a knight-errant. And when he loses all hope of seeing Dulcinea, he reverts to being Alonso Quijano and dies soon afterwards. And there are variations on that, obviously. There's truth in all of this, and the dominant note of Don Quixote's moods is no doubt sadness and melancholy. This in turn is likely to affect to one degree or another the reading experience of the novel. Yet other factors offset it, in my view. To begin with, Don Quixote himself experiences some moments of euphoria, and Sancho assumes his own protagonism with dignity, stoic deliberations, common sense, solidarity, and humorous ingenuity. What's more, Cervantes himself remains at the height of his creative powers, maintaining a playful mood, dexterously working through the major themes, introducing new materials, and delivering a text every bit as rich and inventive as all that comes before. Except for those Unamunian readers whose main way of reading the novel is to identify with the now defeated hero. This means that Don Quixote's blues are tempered by other strains that produce a rich texture combining bitter, sweet, deep, and witty tones. Similarly, traditional criticism often expresses annoyance, and this is some decades back actually, with the novel as of Don Quixote's defeat at the hands of the Caballero de la Blanca Luna. With Don Quixote put out of action, it seems to such readers that there's little more to say, and they voice impatience that an empty return journey without adventures as such takes as long as it does. A more recent variant of this reading finds a certain exhaustion in Cervantes' resourcefulness, where some kinds of episodes are repeated with variations. For example, the fights with Sanson Carrasco, the stampedes, bulls and pigs, the recurrence of the pastoral theme, or the return to the ducal palace and the resuscitation of Altisidora, according to a logic similar to that of the disenchantment of Dulcinea. Another variant would be that everything in the last 15 chapters or so, or even since the first arrival of the protagonist at the ducal palace, is grim and humiliating for the protagonists, as Cervantes forges an anti-novel. My view is that these approaches are limited, misguided, oblivious to the tones and innovations of the novel's journey to an ending. A more specific criticism is that in the case of the expulsion of the Moriscos, Cervantes' text ultimately falsifies history by leaving the story open-ended, with the hope of Ricote and Ana Felix remaining in Spain, whereas historical truth would show that this was untenable. This is indeed, in fact, there is indeed much that is novelistic and lacking in verisimilitude, particularly in the episode of Ana Felix and the interest and hospitality shown toward the returned Moriscos by the Viceroy of Barcelona and Don Antonio Moreno. However, given the extensive scholarship in recent years regarding Moriscos who never left or who returned, and take into consideration the historical moment of the writing of this part of Don Quixote, the possibility of a favorable resolution should not be excluded. And just this afternoon there was a fascinating talk precisely on Don Antonio Moreno and his capabilities, which I found very suggestive. Despite the games played with the calendar throughout the novel, it's significant that Governor Sancho Panza's letter to his wife Teresa is dated the 20th of July, 1614. And the Duke's letter to Governor Sancho is dated the 16th of August. And yes, I know once we get to Barcelona, we're back in June with San Juan. But previously, the day, month, and year were reported, and that we haven't seen before. It should be noticed that the end of the expulsion was designated 6 months earlier, on February 20th, 1614, when the Consejo de Estado, weary of the whole business, wrote to Philip III, urging him to end the expulsion, allowing those who hadn't left to stay without further litigation, because there are a lot of court cases going on, and limiting the pursuit of Moriscos to those who returned, while at the same time requesting, quote, que se ordene al conde de Salazar que alce la mano de esta negociación. The king immediately accepted this recommendation, restricting the Count of Salazar to dealing only with those who returned. For his part, the Count of Salazar, characterized by Ricote in chapter 65 as relentless in carrying out his duties of expulsion, found himself Powerless to act in the jurisdiction of nobles such as the Count of Salinas in La Mancha, who by and large protected the Moriscos in his districts, as Trevor Dadson has demonstrated and has pointed to other places where this, isolated places, but certain places where this would also have been the case. All of this is to say that the expulsion as such was officially over a half year before the dates indicated within the novel prior to the appearance of Ricote and Ana Felix, and almost 2 years before the publication of Part 2 in late 2015. And then a fair number of Moriscos did return, though by no means en masse. Bernard Vincent has recently argued that the tide of informed opinion with regard to returning Moriscos was already turning towards tolerance as early as 1615. And judging by inquisitorial records in the following decades, penalties, far from the rigors of the expulsion edicts, were generously light or absent, and returning Moriscos by and large remained in Spain, whether clandestinely or openly. In the hands of Don Antonio Moreno, who is accompanied by Ana Felix's old Christian fiancé, Don Gaspar Gregorio, a good case could be made for the reintegration of Ricote, his wife Francisca Ricota, and daughter Ana Felix. This is not simply a matter of novelistic fantasy contravening historical truth. The way one reads this unresolved Morisco story has a significant bearing on how the novel is seen to come to a close. In sum, the fate of the returned Moriscos remains undecided. Cervantes is not trying to vie with Avellaneda or to get him back, in my view. Get back at him. Don Quixote's melancholy does not necessarily set the dominant tone of the novel's closure. The return journeys does not repeat episodes but rather introduces interesting variations and is less centered on Don Quixote than on Sancho, who displays much vitality and resourcefulness. What I'd like to explore here is how the final stretch of the novel places the protagonists in a certain void, in which ready-made explanations of how things happen lose their efficacy. Causes and effects are disengaged. The signs of the world are no longer reliable, and experience at times verges on meaninglessness. Above all, there are many moments of disconnectedness and of unities being undone into metonymies. This void opens up from various factors. Most importantly, perhaps, the neutralization of the chivalric worldview and its modes of making sense of things. It's a void that ushers in a range of alternatives and the possibility of inventing solutions to major problems. So I want to invite you to consider with me, in what remains, a number of passages that we all know, but which merit some close inspection to identify the twists and turns of their underlying thought, with the understanding that the conclusions will be provisional and partial, far from a complete picture. Let's begin with a frequently asked question whose formula would be, what does X have to do with Y? Don Quixote blames himself for suffering the stampede of pigs. He was defeated, he's to blame, and heaven is punishing him. This is a moment of degradation and shame, so perhaps we shouldn't expect Don Quixote's reasoning to be too sound. What exactly is his fault, his culpa, that's the word he uses, other than a lack of prudence, as he says at one point, or a misstep on the part of Rocinante? And why would heaven, el cielo, punish him for this? And what does heaven really mean here? In any event, Don Quixote keeps producing causal sequences related to his own destiny. For Sancho, the notion of divine retribution makes no sense whatsoever, because he too was equally trampled. He mimics Don Quixote's logic, and even exaggerates it with a biblical allusion, only to undo it. También debe de ser castigo del cielo, que a los escuderos de los caballeros vencidos los punten moscas, los coman piojos y les embista la hambre. Si los escuderos fuéramos hijos de los caballeros a quien servimos, o parientes suyos muy cercanos, no fuera mucho que nos alcanzara la pena de sus culpas hasta la cuarta generación. Pero, ¿qué tienen que ver los panzas con los Quijotes? Well, this question does resonate throughout the novel. One of Don Quixote's prime endeavors from the very beginning is to assimilate and connect what in the late stages of the novel reveals itself as disparate and disconnected. At the beginning of part 2, Don Quixote tells Sancho that cuando la cabeza duele, todos los miembros duelen. Y así, siendo yo tu amo y señor, soy tu cabeza, y tú mi parte, pues eres mi criado. Y por esta razón, el mal que a mí me toca, o tocare, a ti te ha de doler, y a mí el tuyo. A synecdochic premise that Sancho immediately disputes with the example of the manteamiento, where his supposed cabeza did not feel the same pain as no. For the knight-errant, the unity of his lady, himself, and his squire is self-evident, so that Sancho's penitence in the form of 3,300 lashes is immediately and causally connected to Dulcinea's disenchantment, as stipulated by Merlin. He seems to hold the same assumption with Altisidora's demise, accepting the logic that Altisidora died because of him, muerta por la crueldad de Don Quixote, as the pseudo-Garcilasan verse expresses it, and that his squire can indeed resuscitate her by being subjected to martyrly pain at the hands of dueñas. This all aligns perfectly with his mode of thinking, as the Duke and Duchess and all their household are keenly aware. Sancho, on the contrary, keeps raising the question, what does this have to do with that? Back in chapter 35, after Merlin spells out the means of Dulcinea's disenchantment, Sancho responds immediately, válate el diablo por modo de desencantar. Yo no sé qué tienen que ver mis posas con los encantos. And a moment later elaborates more fully, parí yo, por ventura, a la señora Dulcinea del Toboso, para que paguen mis posas lo que pecaron sus ojos. El señor mi amo sí que es parte suya, pues la llama a cada paso mi vida, mi alma, sustento y arrimo suyo. Se puede y debe azotar por ella y hacer todas las diligencias necesarias para su desencanto, pero azotarme yo a renuncio. Sancho thus hyperbolizes his master's relation to Dulcinea as synecdochic. Es parte suya, pues la llama mi vida, mi alma, etc. And while recognizing his objective association with Don Quixote, el señor mi amo, dissociates himself from any obligation towards his master with regard to Dulcinea, and denies any causal relationship between the pain of his buttocks and Dulcinea's disenchantment, or the sins of her eyes, as he puts it. Such a causal formula conceptually links two very different kinds of bodies, those of Sancho and Dulcinea, while eliding the body in between, that of Don Quixote. All of this, of course, is devised in order to produce carnivalesque hilarity as it yokes together extreme opposites while leaving the knight-errant out of the formula and making him vitally dependent on his squire. Penitence being the dominant trope applied to Sancho's lashes, there are, of course, echoes from Catholicism in particular, in which certain modes of pain and sacrifice are thought to have a redeeming and revivifying power, as well as from Amadís de Gaula, where the knight indulges in amorous rather than religious penitence. I won't go into the reasoning or practice of displaced penitence here as I have elsewhere, except to say that the penitence twice removed from Dulcinea creates a metonymical chain in which there's no longer any direct relation between the first term and the third, and hence no possible efficacy in inflicting pain on oneself. And efficacy is an important part of sacraments and so forth, right? For Sancho, Dulcinea should do her own penitence, or if not, Don Quixote should do it for her. All of this is highly relevant to the later stages of the novel, where the episode of Altisidora's feigned death puts into play a similar kind of causality, and when this apparently works, as she comes back to life, Don Quixote enthusiastically implores Sancho to proceed with the lashes. Here again, then, Sancho insistently questions the supposed relations between cause and effect. Even before the return to the ducal palace, Sancho says to his master, yo no me puedo persuadir que los azotes de mis posaderas tengan que ver con los desencantos de los encantados. Que es así como dijésemos, si os duele la cabeza, untaos las rodillas. A lo menos yo os haré jurar que en cuantas historias vuestra merced ha leído que tratan de la andante caballería, no ha visto algún desencantado por azotes. The analogy of rubbing ointment on the knees to treat a headache points to the patent absurdity of this logic, as Sancho surmises, has no precedent in the books of chivalry. Don Quixote ignores the question as to whether these books offer any cases like this, but reminds Sancho of his obligation because there is an essential oneness in the relationship of Dulcinea, Don Quixote, and Sancho expressed by a syllogism based on possessive adjectives and pronouns. Los cielos te den gracia para que caigas en la cuenta y en la obligación de que te corre de ayudar a mi señora, que lo es tuya, pues tú eres mío. In this constant questioning of what one thing has to do with another, or one person has to do with another, Sancho is not fooled by pictorial representation when he is dressed up with a black inquisitional tunic with painted flames and a corota with painted devils. According to the color coding and presence of painted flames and devils, this would be among the most sinister attire used for impenitence at an auto de fe. Yet even a very apprehensive Don Quixote can't help laughing when he sees Sancho, revealing just how implausible the costume is on his squire. As for the painting itself, Sancho remarks on the absence of any relationship between the representation and what's represented. Mirábase Sancho de arriba abajo, veíase ardiendo de llamas, pero como no le quemaban, no las estimaba en dos ardites. Quitóse la corota, vio la pintada de diablos, volvióse a poner, diciendo entre sí, aún bien que ni ellas me abrazan, ni ellos me llevan. By extension, he doesn't take at all seriously the representation of himself as a penitenciado por el Santo Oficio, which is what the text states. I should add that Don Quixote too asks elsewhere in these chapters what X has to do with Y. For example, when he asks the poet-singer at the Duke's palace, ¿qué tienen que ver las instancias de Garcilaso con la muerte de esta señora? And he asks Don Álvaro Tarfe whether he sees any resemblance between the other Don Quixote and himself. In these moments, however, Don Quixote appears to be trying to reaffirm his vision of things, of poetry or of himself, rather than question false associations that others would have him believe. By and large, Don Quixote tries to cling to his views of unities and causal sequences. As we all know, Sancho objects to the formula for resuscitating Altisidora, just as he protests against the means of disenchanting Dulcinea. ¿Qué tiene que ver manosearme el rostro con la resurrección de esta dama, de esta doncella? Encanta a Dulcinea y azótame para que se desencante. Muérese Altisidora de males que Dios le quiso darle y habla de resucitar, hacerme a mí 24 mamonas y acribarme el cuerpo a alfilerazos. Estas burlas a un cuñado, que yo soy perro viejo y no hay conmigo tus. Here he goes so far as to call this a malicious prank directed against him, a prank replete with phony, preternatural prescriptions, specifying what kinds of aggressions are to be done to him, how many times, and by whom. Here too, of course, he's obliged to subject himself to this ludic violence. Following Don Quixote's lead, however, he does come away with a new principle that he can use to his benefit, that his body has a unique virtue in the sense of strength, power, virtud, whereby he, as doctor, can cure the ills of others, curar los males ajenos. And note the word ajenos. That would be these people. He doesn't see himself as related to them. by suffering pain and perhaps get paid for it. These reflections lead to further metonymization on the part of Sancho. And here we have some of the cleverest intuitions of the novel's late chapters. One of these is Sancho's request to be paid for his lashes, so that his pain can serve two purposes: wages for himself, and for Don Quixote, the disenchantment of Dulcinea. What's more, when his self-inflicted lashes, in effect on his back rather than on his buttocks, are transferred to the trees around him as he sighs in fake pain, we have an extension of the causal chain, where the sound of the trees and feigned groans substitute for his own pain, such that there is now a linkage from Dulcinea through Don Quixote and Sancho to the trees and moans. This is an ingeniously pragmatic solution. Sancho answers the fiction of the means of disenchantment with his own fiction, thus extending the pseudo-causality out to a fourth element. In the case of Altisidora, Sancho's martirios revive her even before they're done, which in itself is quite amusing, perhaps comparable to Don Quixote's finishing the adventure of the Countess Trifaldi by merely attempting it. But when Altisidora says that el amor depositó mi remedio en los martirios de este buen escudero, Sancho at least imagines a displacement of his own pain one step further onto his ass, his donkey, that is. Bien pudiera el amor depositarlos en los de mi asno. Here too, he has been given no choice, as everyone around him obliges him to comply, as though the world around him were enchanted, provoking him to remark that he finally recognizes the existence of enchanters. Ahora sí que vengo a conocer clara y distintamente que hay encantadores y encantos en el mundo, de quien Dios me libre, pues yo no me sé librar. His world has become enchanted, arresting his own agency, but he finds ways to respond to this enchantment by extending its metonymic logic. With forethought, he asks the Duke and Duchess for the inquisitional apparel, which she grants, and later enters his village with his rucio, covered with the painted tunic, the coroza adjusted on its head, que fue la más nueva transformación y adorno con que se vio jamás jumento en el mundo. The ass has become the inquisitional victim that he was, except that now the parody reaches its limit with the slippage from man to beast. In these chapters, Don Quixote, for his part, suffers moments that refute his interpretation of events in which he personally was deeply engaged. Throughout the novel, many characters have challenged his view of things, of course. But here we find Don Quixote less prone to reassert his chivalric worldview, and we find him perhaps more vulnerable than before to moments that contradict what he believes he has experienced. Tosilos, for example, appears and explains in detail what really happened with regard to Doña Rodriguez and her daughter, an episode whose fictional version was dear to Don Quixote. And later, Altisidora, in a passage full of insults, mocks Don Quixote for having believed she died or was ever enamored of him. ¿Pensáis por ventura, don vencido y don molido a palos, que yo me he muerto por vos? Todo lo que habéis visto esta noche ha sido fingido. Actually, it's a real compendium of insults, the whole paragraph. This is a revelation that could shake his understanding of events, plainly revealing how he was duped into giving credence to Altisidora's love for him, her death because of him, and her resurrection by Sancho's martirios. We also find in the second part of the novel a development of the notion of agüeros, much more so in the first part. Good and bad omens, as has often been pointed out. In fact, it's even in some of the chapter headings. Rocinante's opportune neighing in chapter 4 is taken as a good omen. The entry into El Toboso has its bad omens, including a farmer's random singing of a romance. The saintly images are taken as a very favorable event and in fact prompt Don Quixote to reflect on omens as superstitions, often unfounded, he says, that can just as easily be interpreted as favorable or ominous. quote, llega Cipión a África, tropieza en saltando en tierra, tiénenlo por mal agüero sus soldados, pero él, abrazándose con el suelo, dijo, no te me podrás huir, África, porque te tengo asida y entre mis brazos. Omens are signs read from quite random events and applied to one's own circumstances as portending something good or bad for oneself, even when they usually have nothing to do with oneself. And I'd say even the tripping of the falling of Cipión would be one of those chance events that's applied to a different meaning, a different context. They presuppose extracting sense from something else without regard for the original context and appropriating it. Thus, they belong to the larger question of what X has to do with Y, except that the question itself is suppressed by the answer. Rocinante's nays immediately portend favorably for Don Quixote and Sancho, so it's not necessary to ask why Rocinante, oblivious to the two protagonists, is neighing in a space adjacent to where they are. Similarly, when a passing stranger in El Toboso is heard singing a fragment of a romance, Mala la hubistes, franceses, en esa de Roncesvalles, Don Quixote adapts these verses to his own circumstances, but Sancho asks the underlying question and denies any correlation between one thing and another. ¿Qué hace a nuestro propósito la caza de Roncesvalles? Así pudiera cantar el romance de Calaínos, que todo fuera uno para sucedernos bien o mal en nuestro negocio. By the end of the novel, Sancho is so adept that he, like Cipión in Africa, is able to manipulate the ominous signs that the world randomly produces. This happens, of course, when one boy says to another that he will never see her again. Don Quixote takes this as an omen. ¿No ves tú que aplicando aquella palabra a mi intención quiere significar que no tengo de ver más a Dulcinea? Quite naively, he has just identified the dubious reasoning of omens that he espouses as self-evident. ¿No ves tú que? No? It turns out that there are two separate contexts that coincide to produce the referent Dulcinea. The first one that reveals itself is that of hunters and dogs chasing a hare, which takes refuge under Sancho's rucio. Sancho gathers it up and hands it over to Don Quixote as though it were Dulcinea, following through with the logic of the omen, saying, let's imagine that this hare is Dulcinea. Presupongamos que esta liebre es Dulcinea del Toboso, pursued by dogs who are the enchanters who transformed her into a labradora, and with all the other details that complete the allegory. Concluding, qué mala señal es esta, ni qué mal agüero se puede tomar de aquí. Curiously, however, this liebre is not the original feminine referent of the boy who says, no la has de ver. That referent is the cage of crickets, jaula de grillos. When the boys appear, Sancho does what the interpreters of omens fail to do. He discovers the meaning of the sign in its original context, and then, theatrically, plays out a transference of meaning of the sign from that context to the new context, thus laying bare the absurdity of this contextual shift. He has, in fact, done it twice, once with the liebre and the other with the jaula, thus putting a definitive end to a reading of the world through omens. He aquí, Señor, rompidos y desbaratados estos agüeros, que no tienen que ver más con nuestros sucesos, según que yo imagino, aunque tonto, que con las nubes de antaño. He adds, he oído decir al cura de nuestro pueblo que no es de personas cristianas ni discretas mirar en estas niñerías. Y aún vuestra merced mismo me lo dijo los días pasados, dándome a entender que eran tontos todos aquellos cristianos que miraban en agüeros. Through Sancho, Don Quixote is confronted with his own previous dismissal of the logic of omens. The hunters ask Don Quixote for the liebre, and he gives it to them, diósela. He's probably handing over much more than a liebre. He may be handing over his chivalric illusions, as well as a metaleptic means of transferring the alien signs of the world to himself, from lo ajeno to lo propio. I'd like to conclude this inquiry into how X and Y are or are not related to each other towards the end of the novel, by looking into how Don Quixote explains his misfortune as he and Sancho leave Barcelona. The first term he uses is fortuna. Aquí usó la fortuna conmigo de sus vueltas y revueltas. After giving him a quick lesson in Stoicism, Sancho takes up the image of fortuna, according to what he's been told, as una mujer borracha y antojadiza, y sobre todo ciega, to which Don Quixote replies, lo que te sé decir es que no hay fortuna en el mundo. But he just said there was, right? Ni las cosas que en él suceden, buenas o malas que sean, vienen acaso, sino por particular providencia de los cielos. Y de aquí, another one of his causal inferrals, viene lo que suele decirse, que cada uno es artífice de su ventura. Yo lo he sido de la mía, pero no con la prudencia necesaria. Thus, after denying the existence of fortuna, he asserts that things do not happen by chance, acaso, but by providencia de los cielos. He doesn't explain why they don't happen by chance, or why the providencia de los cielos would bring about his misfortune. And he stretches his argument much further by inferring, y de aquí viene a decirse, ¿no?, that one creates one's own destiny, which he says is precisely what he has done, even if he failed to foresee that Rocinante was no match for his adversary's powerful horse. Yet he makes no attempt to reconcile the idea that, on the one hand, everything issues from heavenly providence, as he said, and on the other, which he's also said, the notion that one is the artificer of one's own fate. While all of this sounds acceptable and echoes many passages that we've heard before in the Quixote, it doesn't seem to add up to much, or to offer any explanation as to why this happened to him. What kind of causality might have been at play to lead to this? The one thing he can hold on to, however, is his capacity to make promises and keep his word. And this, in effect, enables him to guarantee aspects of his own future. Cuando era caballero andante, atrevido y valiente, con mis obras y con mis manos acreditaba mis hechos. Y ahora, cuando soy escudero, pedestre, acreditaré mis palabras cumpliendo la que di de mi promesa. This is how the return journey begins, with those words. This is a journey in which there is no mention at all of the word aventura over the last 6 chapters. The word sucesos appears quite often now, in place of aventuras, perhaps because the protagonists see their experience less as challenges that open up in front of them, in this etymological sense of aventura, than as a series of events, sucesos from suceder. For the most part, Don Quixote's worldview suffers a decline as he becomes less than what he was. But in the void of this last stretch of travel, Sancho takes charge of most of the reasoning and thrives in his own creative improvisations. Untenable unities, synecdoches, resemblances, and causalities tend to be exposed for what they are, and often yield to metonymy. Inquiries into what X has to do with Y abound in these late chapters, leading to resolutions to important questions raised throughout the novel. Thank you. Shall I ask myself a question? Yeah.
In English?
Anything you want.
I actually got a little distracted, so you may have given the answer and I didn't really catch it. I was really intrigued by the notion that you said that Don Quixote feels a oneness, right, with Sancho, Don Quixote, and Dulcinea, and that's why he doesn't feel it's strange to ask that Sancho is the one that does penitence to really, her.
Precisely.
But anyway, so Sancho actually asks if that actually has happened, if there's a precedence in other libros de caballería.
That's right.
Does it exist?
As far as I know, it doesn't.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm assuming it doesn't. Yes.
So Cervantes just invented it, and that's why it's so funny.
I think so. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was fantastic. And I appreciate some of the things about it. One of them is the attention that you have put into this episode of the Inquisitor and all the Inquisitorial subtypes there, that has been, as far as I know, so widely disregarded. And just as a side note, I wonder if this change of this emergent logic in Sancho has anything to do with the change in inquisitorial practices. The fact that Julian, I don't know if it could be, is the one that talks about how the theologians, inquisitors or where theologians, started to be substituted by jurists.
Yeah.
And that came with a very different notion in logic, right? A very different logic.
Yeah.
Where inquisitorial processes were never the same because they were set up differently, the proofs of crimes were demanded differently, and when such logic was applied, it usually resulted in an absolution of the person in charge, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And this book doesn't have to do with, right? This disconnecting the X and Y. I wonder if it has anything to do with this new inquisitorial logic or not.
Okay. We may even have some experts in the history of the Inquisition right here. So if there are, please speak up. The few things I'm going to thank you very much for that question. Cervantes, of course, gets away with this twice in the novel, really, with the Escrutinio de los Libros in chapter 6 of the first part, which is all very explicitly parody satire of the Inquisition. I'm quite sure that he had no love whatsoever for the Inquisition. At the same time, as absolutely right. I mean, if you look at the different waves of the Inquisition at different parts, and in fact, after this period, there were also some pretty gruesome waves. But when you look at them, I mean, obviously there were the conversos, the worst wave whatsoever. But then, of course, then there were Protestants, Moriscos over a long period. But during these years that he's writing the second part of the Quixote, we also have the witch trials in the Basque Country, and the Inquisition was the embodiment of the Enlightenment there. I mean, particularly these particular the inquisitors who were in charge of those trials, who saw it simply as delusion and superstition, precisely, and exonerating nearly everybody from it. And it was the local people and the local priests and so forth, the ones who were adamant at accusing and so forth. So, and even apparently some of these so-called witches became convinced of themselves, but the inquisitors weren't. But many of the cases that I've seen over these particular years were from the Inquisition were actually moral matters. Blasphemy, bigamy, or trigamy, or who knows, these kinds of things were much more frequent right at this particular time, I think, and so if anybody else has another take on this or has more information about it, please. Okay.
Just another question. I really liked how you tried to recuperate some other kinds of important elements from these final chapters, and so working against this notion of melancholy as defining these final chapters. And I agree there's so much more to it than that. But I'm wondering, thinking about these kinds of psychological elements of these final chapters. You mentioned that quote in which you say the return journey begins, right? Don Quixote taking responsibility for his defeat in a sense,
Yes.
and thereafter trying to make these causalities, right? So I'm wondering if there is something about the return journey in general that is, I'm thinking again of these psychological mechanisms you mentioned, the metonymical chain, so I can't help but be thinking through psychology and psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
Are there some kinds of justification, denial? It seems that Don Quixote kind of leaves those behind, right, in a way, basic responsibility. But the return journey of Quixote, which you also mentioned, he also, on his way back, takes that guilt, right? He sort of says, we were guilty, and so that our expulsion was necessary. So is there something
If you believe it.
Right. But is there something about the return journey and how to narrate that holds a kind of psychological justification?
I mean, there must be. This is it for Don Quixote, not for Sancho. But we know that this is his last journey of perhaps one of the most errant characters in all of literature, who was sedentary before he started, some months before. But I'm reminded with your question of Andrés Lema Incapier's talk yesterday about the deaths of Don Quixote, and particularly, he presented 4 different versions of it, and the last 2 were especially of interest to me. Borges' version, where Borges talks about the friendship that we have with these characters, and with Don Quixote in particular because of the death, but with Sancho also. And the cumulative effect of this, so that even when we feel that Don Quixote has become diminished, there is a sense that and even when he dies in the second half of a sentence. This wasn't said yesterday, but he dies in the second half of a sentence that doesn't begin talking about him. No, so it's quiero decir que murió. I mean, dio el espíritu. So even though it seems to be intranscendental in a sense, the way it's described right there, there is this cumulative effect, I think, that we have through not only one reading, but the many readings that we all have done of this novel that is impossible to avoid. There's just all of Don Quixote from the beginning to the end, and many times over, is carried right through. That's, for me, at least that's the way I feel about it. So in that sense, I would also agree with the melancholic reading of it, except that I think there are many other things, as I said, that are also present there, so we shouldn't give in. And it's to some extent, as we brought out in the discussion yesterday, reading the end of Don Quixote is to some extent a way of reading there's something quite personal about it, and if we are more melancholic ourselves, we're more inclined to give that kind of reading, which I'm not. I'm not that temperament. So.
Yes, I heard Andres' talk yesterday also, and he was very affected by the end. In other words, he felt like crying at the end. And I like very much what you said at the end of the trip, that it's not an aventura, but I think you used the phrase, signs of the world are no longer reliable. Yeah. That is that moved me very much, even, without that last death scene. That is more moving to me than, que se murió. So I just wondered, because I feel that after the middle of life, signs of the world are no longer around.
And in a sense, I was trying to bring that out partly, of course, with the example that we all know of the omens in chapter 73, as they're about to enter their village, that the unreliable and signs of the world are no longer reliable, but it's actually a much broader statement that refers to much else. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
una pregunta más. Bueno, que gracias.